They thought she was invisible, just a cook, just hands that stirred the pot while powerful men whispered their darkest secrets over candlelight. But one stormy night, when she overheard a plan to burn the slave quarters for profit, she did something unthinkable. She wrote everything down. Names, dates, crimes, and what started as ink on paper would soon shake an entire plantation to its core. Long before the sun rose over the fields, before the overseer's whistle sliced through the morning air, before the cotton leaves shimmered with dew like tiny trembling ghosts, there was already smoke rising from the kitchen house. The kitchen stood apart from the grand manor, close enough to serve it, far enough to keep its heat, its smells, and its secrets from disturbing the fine sensibilities of those who lived in white-pillared comfort. And inside that kitchen, while the rest of the plantation slept, stood Eliza May, the cook who heard everything. The plantation was called Ravenhill, nestled deep in the American South, not far from the Mississippi River, where humidity hung heavy and the soil was stained with generations of forced labor. Ravenhill was owned by a man named Jeremiah Caldwell, a man whose name carried weight in the county courthouse and whose smile could convince a jury or crush a life depending on the day. But it was Eliza who knew the truth about him. She knew it not because she sought it, but because secrets always found their way to the kitchen. Eliza had been brought to Ravenhill when she was 12 years old. She remembered the iron chains less than she remembered the smell of onions frying in animal fat. Food had always been survival. Food had always been listening. When she stirred the pots, people spoke freely around her, as though she were part of the smoke itself, present but invisible. Over time, she learned something powerful. The most dangerous truths are whispered between bites. By the time she was 35, Eliza ran the kitchen like a silent general. She controlled what was served, when it was served, and how it was seasoned. She understood the moods of the house through appetite. If the master wanted whiskey before supper, someone in the fields had likely been whipped. If Mrs. Caldwell skipped dessert, she had discovered another betrayal. If guests lingered long after pie was served, business darker than cotton trading was being discussed, and they always discussed it near her. Men believed a cook was furniture, pair of hands, an apron. They believed she had no memory beyond recipes. But Eliza remembered everything. She remembered the night 2 plantation owners from neighboring counties came for supper, their boots muddy, their laughter loud and swollen with liquor. They spoke of auctions, not of cattle but of people. They compared prices as if debating tobacco quality. A boy of 14 sold for a high sum because of his shoulders. A mother separated from her child because she wouldn't break. Eliza kept her eyes on the cornbread as she listened. She memorized the names. She remembered the night Mrs. Caldwell cried quietly at the long oak table while Jeremiah told her she was ungrateful. The door to the dining room had been left slightly ajar. Eliza had heard the slap. She had heard the porcelain shatter. The next morning, she served blackberry preserves to cover the swelling beneath Mrs. Caldwell's eye. But the plantation's darkness did not end with cruelty alone. It was layered with conspiracy. Jeremiah Caldwell was more than a plantation owner. He was a silent partner in illegal shipments that moved through the river at night. Cotton was not the only cargo loaded under moonlight. There were crates that clinked like metal and others that did not move at all. Eliza knew this because she prepared meals for the men who guarded those shipments. Hungry men talked, especially when they believed the only ears listening were obedient ones. For years, she stored every word inside her mind. But memory is heavy, and one night memory demanded ink. It happened during a summer storm so violent it seemed heaven itself was tearing open. Rain pounded the roof of the kitchen house. Lightning illuminated the yard where cabins stood crowded together. The master and his guests had retreated early after too much drink, leaving half-eaten plates and spilled wine. Eliza remained behind, scrubbing the wooden table long after the dishes were stacked. Her hands were trembling. That evening she had overheard something different. Not the usual brutality. Not business as usual. Something worse. Jeremiah and his closest associate had spoken in hushed tones near the fireplace. They believed no one lingered. But Eliza had lingered. She always lingered. There was to be an incident, Jeremiah had said. A staged escape. A fire set intentionally in the slave quarters to collect insurance money. A tragedy that would bring sympathy and profit in equal measure. Names were mentioned, families chosen like unwanted inventory. Eliza had felt something inside her fracture. Up until that moment, survival had meant silence. But silence now meant complicity in a massacre. That night, when the storm drowned the world in noise, she took something forbidden from beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen. Scraps of paper stolen over months, a stub of pencil taken from the master's desk, and a small cloth-bound notebook discarded years ago by Mrs. Caldwell. Eliza lit a single candle, and she began to write. Her handwriting was uneven at first. She had taught herself letters in secret by studying discarded newspapers and listening when the master's children practiced their lessons. Every word felt like rebellion. She wrote about the auctions. She wrote about the beatings. She wrote about the illegal shipments. She wrote about the insurance scheme and the planned fire. She wrote names, dates, details, times. She wrote until her fingers cramped and wax burned low. Outside, thunder cracked like gunfire. Inside, history was being documented by the one person everyone believed too insignificant to matter. But writing was not simply an act of record. It was an act of decision. Because once written, the truth could no longer be swallowed. Eliza did not yet know what she would do with the notebook. She only knew that if the plantation burned, the lies would not be the only thing. Turning to ash, there would be proof. There would be testimony. There would be something that could not be silenced. As dawn approached, she hid the notebook beneath a loose brick behind the hearth. The storm passed. The plantation woke. And the day began as though nothing had shifted. But something had. Eliza moved through her morning duties differently. Every glance she exchanged with the field hands carried weight. She studied the cabins as if measuring how quickly flames might consume them. She watched Jeremiah from across the yard, noting the casual way he mounted his horse, the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. The fire was planned for 3 nights later. And now 3 nights stood between obedience and defiance. What Eliza did not realize was that secrets have a pulse of their own. When you begin to gather them, they begin to gather you. By midday, whispers traveled through the quarters. A rumor of something coming. An unusual number of barrels had been delivered. Extra guards were posted near the river. The air felt tense, electric. Eliza returned to the kitchen and stirred the stew. Outwardly, nothing betrayed her. Inwardly, she had crossed a threshold. Because writing the truth meant she could no longer pretend she had not heard it. And in a world built on forced silence, one woman holding a notebook had become the most dangerous presence on Ravenhill Plantation. The darkest history is rarely written by those in power. Sometimes it is written by the one who serves the food. And this was only the beginning. The morning after the storm broke with unnatural calm, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Ravenhill looked almost peaceful beneath the rising sun. The fields shimmered in gold light, and mist clung low over the ground like a veil drawn across something shameful. But peace on a plantation was always an illusion. It existed only for those who did not have to fear what the day might bring. Eliza felt the shift before anyone else named it. She had slept no more than an hour, her mind replaying every word she had written. The notebook hidden behind the loose brick felt heavier than iron chains. Knowledge had weight, and now she carried it not just in memory, but in ink. In the kitchen house, she worked as she always had, steady, precise, unremarkable. Cornmeal sifted through her fingers. Bacon fat hissed in the pan. Biscuits rose in the oven. The rhythm of cooking steadied her racing thoughts. But the ordinary movements felt different now. Every stir of the pot felt like winding a clock toward something inevitable. Jeremiah Caldwell entered just before noon. He did not often step into the kitchen himself. He preferred to summon, not approach. His presence there was enough to make even the air tighten. He removed his gloves slowly, surveying the room as though measuring its worth. "Eliza," he said, his voice almost gentle. That tone unsettled her more than shouting would have. "Yes, sir," she replied. keeping her eyes lowered but her ears sharp. "You've been here a long time." It was not a question. "Yes, sir." He stepped closer to the preparation table. She could smell tobacco and river mud on him. "You hear things in this house, don't you?" Her pulse hammered in her throat, but her face remained composed. "Just kitchen matters, sir." He studied her longer than usual. Jeremiah Caldwell was not a foolish man. Cruel, yes. Greedy, certainly, but not blind. He understood power, and power meant control of information. If he sensed the slightest crack in that control, he would seal it permanently. Finally, he nodded once. "Good. Best not to let talk travel where it shouldn't." And just like that, he left. But his visit confirmed something chilling. Suspicion was beginning to stir. That afternoon, additional guards appeared near the quarters. Barrels of kerosene were delivered under the guise of winter preparation. Though winter was months away, the insurance agent had visited 2 days prior. Eliza had noticed the papers exchanged, the handshake too firm to be casual. 3 nights. The timeline pulsed in her mind. When supper approached, a different kind of gathering took place in the dining hall. 3 neighboring plantation owners arrived, their laughter booming across the yard. Eliza served roasted chicken, buttered greens, and peach cobbler. She moved silently between them, refilling glasses, adjusting plates. And she listened. The men spoke more boldly than before. There was confidence in their tone, the swagger of those who believe consequences are for others. They joked about clearing old inventory. They spoke of sympathy from newspapers. They mentioned how fires had improved operations elsewhere. One man laughed and said, "Ashes are cheaper than upkeep." The words lodged in Eliza's chest like splinters. As she returned to the kitchen, she found Samuel waiting by the back door. Samuel was older than most. His back bent from years in the fields, but his mind sharp as flint. He had been born on Ravenhill. He knew its soil better than any map. "You've heard it too," he said quietly. Eliza paused. This was the moment when silence could preserve her safety, or truth could risk everything. "Yes," she said. He did not ask how. He did not need to. "They mean to burn us," he whispered. The simplicity of the sentence made it more terrifying than any elaborate scheme. Eliza glanced toward the manor. 3 nights. Samuel's jaw tightened. "How many know?" "Enough to make it real," she replied. For the first time in her life, Eliza did something she had never allowed herself to do. She shared what she had written. Not the notebook itself, that was too dangerous, but the details, the insurance plan, the staged escape, the names chosen to be lost. Samuel listened without interruption. When she finished, the kitchen felt smaller. "You wrote it down?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Then the truth exists outside their mouths." That realization hung between them. If the quarters burned, the narrative would belong to Jeremiah. It would be called an accident, a tragic attempt at escape, a cautionary tale. But if the truth survived, if someone carried it beyond Ravenhill, the story could not be buried so easily. But survival required more than ink. That night, word spread carefully through whispers. Not panic, not yet, but preparation. Families quietly packed what little they owned. Buckets of water were filled and hidden behind cabins. Escape routes were discussed in murmurs beneath the cover of darkness. Eliza remained in the kitchen, outwardly obedient, inwardly orchestrating resistance. The second day passed with unnatural stillness. Even the overseer seemed distracted, pacing more than usual. The guards rotated more frequently. The river dock saw increased activity. And then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Caldwell came to the kitchen alone. Her face was pale, the fading bruise beneath her eye barely concealed by powder. She dismissed the young maid with a wave and closed the door behind her. "Eliza," she said, her voice trembling in a way Eliza had never heard before. "Is it true?" The question pierced the room. Eliza did not respond immediately. She studied the woman before her, a beneficiary of cruelty, yet also bruised by it. Prisoner in silk. "Is what true, ma'am?" Eliza asked carefully. "The fire," Mrs. Caldwell whispered. So she had heard it too. Power was cracking at the edges. Eliza realized something critical. Jeremiah had not shared the full plan with his wife. Perhaps he feared her conscience. Perhaps he feared her unpredictability. Yes, Eliza said softly. Tears welled in the woman's eyes. He said it was necessary. For profit, Eliza asked before she could stop herself. The boldness shocked them both. Mrs. Caldwell sank into a chair. You must understand, I have no control. Control. The word tasted bitter. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mrs. Caldwell did something astonishing. She reached into her dress pocket and placed a small brass key on the table. The storage shed by the river, she whispered. There are horses. If something happens. She did not finish the sentence. She did not apologize. But she left the key behind. After she left, Eliza stared at it for a long time. Power was shifting in unpredictable ways. By the third evening, tension coiled through Ravenhill like a drawn bowstring. The sky burned orange as the sun sank, as though foreshadowing what might come. Guards took positions. Kerosene barrels had been discreetly placed near the quarters under the excuse of maintenance. Jeremiah dined early. He appeared calm. Too calm. Eliza's hands remained steady as she served the meal, but her mind moved rapidly. The notebook behind the hearth. The key on the shelf. Samuel waiting near the cabins. Buckets hidden. Routes planned. And then, as darkness settled fully over the plantation, the first lantern was dropped. Not by the guards, but by someone else. Flames erupted near the farthest cabin, leaping hungrily against dry wood. For a split second, confusion reigned. Guards shouted. Families screamed. Smoke thickened instantly. But this was not the fire Jeremiah had planned. This was different. It was controlled, contained. Samuel had moved first. The fire was set at the edge, a signal, not a slaughter. In the chaos, families ran, not blindly, but toward the river shed, toward the horses, toward escape. Jeremiah roared orders, but the confusion was too great. He had intended fear. Instead, he faced strategy. Eliza stood in the yard, smoke curling around her, watching as control slipped from the master's hands. The kitchen, once a place of silent obedience, had become the birthplace of rebellion. And behind the hearth, hidden in brick and ash, rested a notebook that could destroy everything Jeremiah Caldwell believed untouchable. But rebellion has consequences. And as gunshots cracked through the night air, Eliza understood that the darkest chapter of Ravenhill was not ending. It was only beginning to fight back. The fire had not spread the way Jeremiah Caldwell intended, and that alone altered the balance of power on Ravenhill Plantation. Flames had licked the outer cabin walls but had not consumed the heart of the quarters. Smoke rolled across the yard in thick, choking waves, yet beneath the chaos there was structure, intention, and something Jeremiah had not accounted for: unity. The sound of screaming had been real, but it had not been surrender. It had been signal. Buckets appeared from shadows. Water moved in desperate, coordinated arcs. The blaze was both distraction and declaration. And while Caldwell shouted commands that dissolved into gunfire and confusion, something irreversible had already begun. Eliza did not run with the others toward the river shed. Her position was too visible, her absence too noticeable. Instead, she remained near the kitchen house, coughing through smoke, forcing her body to appear panicked but not purposeful. Years of invisibility had trained her well. A cook was expected to tremble, not strategize. Yet her mind was sharper than ever. She watched which guards broke rank. She counted the shots fired. She noticed which men hesitated before aiming into the dark. Fear was spreading, but not only among the enslaved. The overseer had not anticipated resistance with foresight. Caldwell had not anticipated disobedience with planning. They had planned a tragedy, not opposition. Gunshots eventually slowed. The controlled blaze dwindled under relentless water and frantic stamping of boots. One cabin smoldered heavily, its roof partially collapsed, but the rest stood wounded rather than destroyed. The illusion of accidental catastrophe had failed before it could be staged. Caldwell's fury became something feral. He struck one of the guards across the face, accusing him of incompetence. He accused the quarters of conspiracy. He demanded names, but names did not surface. Even under threat, silence held. Not the silence of fear, the silence of protection. Before dawn, Caldwell ordered a search of every cabin. Belongings were overturned, straw mattresses ripped open, floorboards pried loose. He was no longer trying to create a narrative for insurance. He was trying to locate betrayal. Eliza understood then that suspicion would eventually drift toward the kitchen. Secrets did not ignite themselves. Someone had known. Someone had anticipated. And Jeremiah Caldwell was not a man accustomed to losing control of information. When the search reached the kitchen house, Eliza stood aside as boots tracked soot across her clean floors. She kept her breathing measured as men rummaged through cupboards and storage bins. The hearth drew particular attention. One guard used a metal poker to disturb the ash. Eliza felt her spine turn to ice. The loose brick sat inches from exposure. Years of composure compressed into seconds of unbearable stillness. The guard jabbed twice, muttered about wasted time, and moved on. The brick remained undisturbed. The notebook remained hidden. But the margin between survival and discovery had narrowed to a breath. By midday, Ravenhill felt different. The plantation no longer operated under routine authority. It operated under paranoia. Caldwell assembled the entire labor force in the yard, his voice hoarse from shouting through smoke. He announced harsher restrictions. No one was to leave the quarters without escort. Night patrols would double. Food rations would be reduced until loyalty was restored. He framed the resistance as ingratitude. He called it savagery. He promised punishment severe enough to erase the memory of defiance. But even as he spoke, something in his posture betrayed uncertainty. His plan had collapsed publicly. Control, once unquestioned, now required enforcement through visible fear. Eliza returned to the kitchen with new awareness. The notebook was no longer just documentation. It was leverage. It contained proof of intent, the insurance fraud, the planned massacre, the illegal shipments along the river. If that record reached the right ears beyond Ravenhill, Caldwell's influence could fracture. But transporting truth was more dangerous than writing it. Anyone found carrying such evidence would not survive to defend its contents. That evening, Samuel managed to slip into the kitchen under the excuse of collecting leftover scraps. His face bore soot streaks and exhaustion, but his eyes held something steadier than fear. He spoke quietly while Eliza chopped vegetables, their movements synchronized to avoid suspicion. He confirmed that several families had reached the river shed during the confusion. 2 horses had been taken. Tracks suggested at least 4 people had escaped beyond the tree line before patrols tightened. It was not a mass exodus, but it was proof that Ravenhill's boundaries were not absolute. The knowledge strengthened something inside Eliza. Escape was no longer theoretical, yet retaliation followed swiftly. The next morning, 3 men were pulled from the quarters and accused of inciting the fire. There was no evidence presented. There was no trial. Punishment was administered publicly to restore dominance. Eliza forced herself to remain upright as the lash fell. She memorized the count. She memorized the injuries. She memorized the way Caldwell watched not the men being beaten, but the faces in the crowd, measuring submission. She understood then that her notebook must also record this, not only plans prevented, but cruelty enacted in response. That night, after the yard fell quiet and patrol routes settled into predictable patterns, Eliza retrieved the notebook from behind the brick. Her hands trembled not from fear but from urgency. She added new entries beneath candlelight. She documented the failed arson scheme, the retaliatory punishments, the names of the escaped families, the escalating security measures. She described Caldwell's public rage and the cracks beneath it. Her handwriting grew steadier with each line. The act of recording transformed helpless witnessing into preservation. If she could not immediately dismantle the system, she could at least deny it the comfort of secrecy. Days passed under suffocating watchfulness. Supplies from the river slowed. Caldwell traveled unexpectedly to the county seat, likely to repair narratives before rumors spread. Eliza sensed that time was tightening. News of the attempted fire would reach neighboring plantations regardless of Caldwell's efforts. Questions would surface. Insurance representatives might inquire if she could deliver the notebook to someone beyond Caldwell's influence. A preacher sympathetic to abolition, a journalist willing to investigate, a lawyer seeking leverage, the plantation's isolation could be breached. Opportunity arrived in an unexpected form. Mrs. Caldwell returned to the kitchen late one afternoon, pale and restless. Her composure had thinned since the failed fire. She confessed in halting whispers that her husband feared investigation. The insurance claim could not proceed without scrutiny. There were inconsistencies. She admitted she had overheard arguments between Caldwell and his associates. The failed plan had cost more than money. It had exposed division among powerful men. Eliza listened carefully. Power fractures from within before it collapses outward. If Caldwell's allies doubted him, his shield weakened. Mrs. Caldwell's fear was not rooted in morality alone. It was rooted in instability. She hinted that her husband intended to relocate certain documents from the study to a safer location near the river warehouse. Important documents, contracts, letters, perhaps records that, combined with Eliza's notebook, could form undeniable proof. That knowledge reshaped the stakes. The notebook alone was testimony. Additional documents would be evidence. Together they could dismantle not only Caldwell, but the network that protected him. But acquiring them would require precision beyond anything Eliza had attempted. Surveillance intensified after rumors reached the plantation that federal inspectors might pass through the region within the year. The political climate beyond Ravenhill was shifting. Whispers of abolition were growing louder in northern states. Caldwell's temper shortened as uncertainty expanded. He drank more heavily. He trusted fewer people. Paranoia is a corrosive force. It isolates even the powerful. One evening, as rain threatened again in distant thunder, Eliza made a decision that would define everything that followed. The notebook could not remain hidden indefinitely. The longer it stayed on Ravenhill soil, the greater the risk of discovery. She wrapped it in oilcloth and stitched it into the lining of a flour sack stored among dozens of identical sacks in the pantry. If searched casually, it would appear untouched. If seized roughly, flour would conceal its presence. It was not perfect protection, but it bought time. Time, however, was shrinking. A patrol discovered hoofprints near the river that suggested more than 2 horses had departed during the fire. Caldwell ordered extended searches into nearby woods. Dogs were brought in. The atmosphere thickened with dread. Eliza realized that if the escaped families were captured, interrogation might expose internal coordination. Even without her name spoken, suspicion could spiral unpredictably. The plantation no longer felt like a closed system. It felt like a battlefield disguised as farmland. And beneath the quiet labor of cooking and cleaning, beneath the measured obedience she performed daily, Eliza carried something more dangerous than flame. She carried narrative power, the ability to define events not as accidents, not as rebellions, without cause but as calculated brutality and organized resistance. Ravenhill believed it had suppressed a fire. It had not yet realized that the most destructive blaze was written in ink and waiting for wind. The days following the failed burning did not return Ravenhill to normal. Instead, they reshaped it into something tighter, colder, and more dangerous. The plantation no longer functioned through routine cruelty alone but through sharpened suspicion. Jeremiah Caldwell moved like a man who had glimpsed the edge of his own vulnerability. He trusted fewer voices, drank more heavily, and kept armed men closer to the manor house even in daylight. The illusion of invincibility that once surrounded him had thinned, and he compensated with harsher displays of dominance. Yet beneath that aggression was calculation. He was searching for the fracture point, for the unseen hand that had disrupted his design. Eliza felt that search circling closer each day. In the kitchen, she continued her work with the same steady precision that had kept her invisible for years. She salted meat, kneaded dough, boiled coffee, and kept her gaze respectfully lowered. But internally, her thoughts moved with strategic urgency. The notebook hidden inside the flour sack could not remain on the plantation much longer. Every additional search, every unpredictable inspection, increased the risk. The ink inside those pages had already crossed the line from observation to indictment. If discovered, it would not merely be confiscated. It would be used as proof of conspiracy. News from outside Ravenhill arrived in fragments carried by traders and passing laborers. There was talk of shifting political tides, of abolitionist movements gaining ground in certain states, of journalists exposing corruption tied to plantation economies. Caldwell dismissed such developments publicly, but privately he began transferring assets. Wagons carried crates to the river warehouse under cover of darkness. Documents were removed from the manor study. Letters were burned in the fireplace late into night. Eliza noticed the smell of scorched paper drifting into the kitchen long after supper had ended. Desperation leaves tracer. One afternoon, while preparing preserves, Eliza overheard Caldwell arguing with a visiting associate in the adjacent room. The argument was sharper than previous disagreements. The associate accused Caldwell of recklessness. The failed fire had drawn attention. Insurance representatives were asking questions. If federal oversight increased, their shipping operations along the river could be exposed. Caldwell responded with threats disguised as reassurance. He insisted that loyalty would be rewarded and betrayal punished. But the associate's tone carried doubt. Power was fracturing not just from below, but from within its own ranks. That fracture presented opportunity. Mrs. Caldwell returned again to the kitchen under the pretense of discussing household expenses. Her movements were anxious, her composure eroded by weeks of tension. In quiet fragments, she revealed that certain ledgers and contracts had indeed been moved to the river warehouse for temporary safety. She spoke without fully understanding the weight of what she was confirming. She wanted reassurance, perhaps absolution. Instead, she gave Eliza confirmation that written proof of Caldwell's illegal dealings existed beyond her own notebook. Combining those records with her testimony could dismantle more than one man. But retrieving them required access to the warehouse, a structure guarded more heavily since the failed burning. It stood near the riverbank, where shipments arrived under cover of night. Guards rotated in pairs. Lanterns burned late. Patrol routes overlapped intentionally. It was not impenetrable, but it was dangerous. Eliza began observing patterns the way she once memorized dinner conversations. She noted which guards grew careless after midnight, which favored whiskey, which avoided river duty during heavy rain. She paid attention to the timing of supply deliveries. She cataloged information mentally, building a map of vulnerability. The plantation believed it had suppressed rebellion. It did not recognize that rebellion had shifted from open flame to quiet infiltration. Meanwhile, retaliation continued in subtler forms. Rations remained reduced. Work hours lengthened. Punishments were administered for minor infractions. Caldwell wanted submission restored through exhaustion. Yet exhaustion can also dull fear, and dulled fear makes risk conceivable. Samuel met Eliza less frequently now. Surveillance had tightened, but when they did exchange words, it was enough. He confirmed that the escaped families had not been captured. Tracks had been lost beyond the swamp edge. That small victory sustained morale in ways Caldwell could not quantify. It proved that Ravenhill was not an inescapable cage. The night chosen for movement came unexpectedly when a violent storm rolled in from the west, heavier even than the one before the failed fire. Rain battered the plantation with relentless force. Thunder cracked so violently it shook window panes. Patrol patterns adjusted under the assumption that no one would attempt escape in such conditions. Visibility dropped. Lanterns flickered uselessly against sheets of rain. It was the kind of night Caldwell had once used to hide his own illegal shipments. Eliza wrapped herself in a coarse shawl and carried a sack of flour toward the outer storage area as though responding to a kitchen leak. The notebook remained stitched inside. Her heart pounded not with panic but with focus. Each step through mud felt deliberate. The storm masked smaller sounds. The shift of a latch, the scrape of wood. Near the warehouse, She saw only one guard under the overhang, hunched against rain, distracted by discomfort more than vigilance. Timing is a fragile ally. She circled toward the rear entrance where supply crates were stacked. The door was secured but not bolted from within. Caldwell had prioritized preventing entry from outside the grounds, not infiltration from within. Eliza slipped inside the dim interior where the scent of damp wood and tobacco mingled. Lightning-illuminated shelves stacked with crates. On a central table lay several ledgers bound in dark leather. Her hands moved quickly but carefully. She opened the first ledger and scanned columns of figures, shipment dates, quantities, coded notations. The second ledger contained names tied to transactions beyond cotton. Payments routed through intermediaries, references to river captains. Enough detail to expose a network. She could not carry the books out entirely. Their absence would be noticed immediately. Instead, she tore several critical pages free, folding them tightly and sliding them into the flour sacks lining alongside her notebook. Each torn page increased the risk of discovery but also deepened the weight of proof. Thunder masked the sound of ripping paper. Footsteps echoed outside. Eliza closed the ledgers precisely as she had found them and slipped back into the storm. The guard glanced at her briefly but did not challenge a kitchen worker carrying supplies during heavy rain. Power had long dismissed her as harmless. That dismissal protected her once more. By the time she returned to the kitchen, soaked and shivering, the plantation remained unaware that its secrets had been physically divided. The warehouse still contained most records, but not all. A fracture had been created. If Caldwell discovered missing pages, suspicion would ignite violently. If he did not, time remained to move the evidence beyond Ravenhill entirely. Over the next 2 days, Caldwell's agitation increased. Something in his demeanor suggested he sensed instability without identifying its source. He ordered another search of cabins and outbuildings, claiming routine inspection. The kitchen was examined again. Flour sacks were prodded but not cut open. Eliza maintained steady breathing as hands pressed against the very fabric concealing the most damning truths on the property. Paranoia began turning inward among Caldwell's associates. Rumors. The air over Ravenhill grew unnaturally still in the days before the preacher's arrival, as though the land itself sensed a turning point. Jeremiah Caldwell moved through his estate with forced composure, but the strain in him had become visible even to those trained not to look directly at power. He barked orders more frequently. He questioned guards twice for the same details. He visited the river warehouse at irregular hours, inspecting ledgers with restless intensity. Something unsettled him. He did not yet know what had been taken, but instinct told him something had shifted beyond his control. Eliza felt that tension like a tightening wire inside her chest. The flour sack remained in its place among dozens of identical sacks, the notebook and torn ledger pages stitched into its lining. Every day that passed increased the chance of accidental discovery. Every hour strengthened her resolve. Writing had been defiance. Removing evidence had been escalation. Delivering it would be irreversible. The traveling preacher arrived under overcast skies, his wagon modest and unthreatening, his manner humble enough not to alarm plantation owners who believed they controlled every voice that stepped onto their land. He spoke gently of scripture, obedience, order, and salvation when standing before men like Caldwell. But in quieter tones, in cabins after dusk, his sermons shifted. He spoke of deliverance not only of the soul but of the body. He spoke of Pharaoh and chains. He spoke carefully, never directly inciting, but planting something stronger than fear, possibility. Eliza observed him from a distance at first. Trust was not given freely. She watched how he listened when field hands spoke. She noticed that he asked questions rather than issuing declarations. She saw how he lowered his voice rather than raising it when discussing suffering. This was not a man careless with words, and words, she knew better than anyone, could reshape history. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Caldwell requested that the preacher dine at the manor as a gesture of public piety. Eliza prepared the meal herself, ensuring every dish arrived flawlessly. The preacher thanked her directly when she placed the plates, meeting her eyes briefly in a way few white men ever did. There was no pity in his gaze, only recognition. That brief exchange confirmed what she needed to know. After supper, as the preacher prepared to return to his wagon, a sudden commotion erupted near the stables. A horse had broken loose, spooked by distant thunder. The distraction drew guards and Caldwell alike toward the yard. In that narrow window of fractured attention, Eliza stepped quietly toward the wagon carrying a sack of flour balanced against her hip. Her movements were steady, practiced. No rush, no visible urgency. She reached the wagon as the preacher adjusted his coat. Without ceremony, without speech, she lifted the sack into the rear storage compartment and met his eyes again. This time, her gaze carried weight. He hesitated only a fraction of a second before nodding once. No words passed. None were needed. The exchange lasted less than 5 seconds. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen as if nothing significant had occurred. Inside the wagon rested more than flour. It carried the documented intent to commit arson for profit. It carried proof of illegal as the preacher departed at dawn the following morning. Caldwell offered polite farewells, unaware that something irreversible rolled away with the wagon wheels. Eliza stood at the kitchen window, watching dust rise along the road until the figure disappeared beyond the tree line. She did not allow relief to surface. Relief invited shipments and financial manipulation. It carried names and dates and evidence that could unravel not just one plantation but a network bound by shared corruption. It carried the truth written by someone the system had long considered voiceless. As the preacher departed at dawn the following morning, Caldwell offered polite farewells, unaware that something irreversible rolled away with the wagon wheels. Eliza stood at the kitchen window, watching dust rise along the road until the figure disappeared beyond the tree line. She did not allow relief to surface. Relief invited carelessness. The danger was not over. It had merely shifted locations. 2 days later, the first crack appeared. A messenger arrived from the county seat bearing sealed correspondence for Caldwell. The master read it alone in his study. Those who passed near the door heard nothing but the heavy thud of furniture struck in anger. By afternoon, Caldwell's agitation had transformed into open fury. He summoned his closest associate immediately. Rumors spread quickly. Inquiries had begun regarding irregular insurance filings. Questions were being asked about shipping manifests along the river. Names were surfacing in places they should not have appeared. The missing ledger pages had been discovered. The warehouse had been searched thoroughly. Guards were interrogated. Accusations flew between partners. Caldwell accused betrayal within his own ranks. He ordered another sweeping search of cabins and outbuildings, more violent than before. This time, flour sacks were sliced open indiscriminately. White powder spilled across floors like fallen ash. But the sack that had carried the notebook was already miles away. Suspicion turned desperate. Caldwell demanded confessions from the labor force, convinced that someone had coordinated theft from within. Punishments escalated. Yet no evidence remained on Ravenhill soil to substantiate his accusations. He had built his authority on secrecy. Now secrecy had abandoned him. Weeks passed under tightening scrutiny from beyond the plantation's borders. Federal representatives began investigating shipping routes along the Mississippi. Financial irregularities linked back to Caldwell's accounts. Former associates distanced themselves publicly. The illusion of unity fractured rapidly when legal consequences threatened wealth. Power built on mutual benefit dissolves quickly under threat of exposure. One evening, word reached Ravenhill that printed reports had begun circulating in northern cities describing corruption tied to southern plantations, including allegations of staged fires for insurance profit. Though Ravenhill was not named directly at first, the details mirrored too closely to dismiss. Caldwell's rage became unpredictable. He accused enemies of fabrication. He blamed political rivals. But inside, he understood what had happened. The truth had escaped. The plantation atmosphere shifted again, this time not with paranoia alone but with erosion. Guards left quietly, seeking employment elsewhere. Associates withdrew financial backing. Supply shipments slowed under legal review. Caldwell traveled frequently to defend himself, leaving Ravenhill under strained supervision. Authority requires perception of inevitability. Once that perception falters, control weakens rapidly. Eliza observed these changes with restrained awareness. She did not celebrate. Celebration would be premature and dangerous. But she recognized collapse in its early stages. The quarters felt subtly different. Conversations carried cautious hope. The knowledge that someone, though unnamed, had reached beyond the plantation walls altered morale more powerfully than open revolt had. Months later, formal charges were filed against Jeremiah Caldwell related to fraud and illegal trade practices. The investigation expanded outward, pulling other names into scrutiny. Though the system itself remained deeply unjust, cracks had formed in places once considered immovable. Caldwell's reputation deteriorated publicly. Investors withdrew. His legal battles drained resources rapidly. Ravenhill did not transform overnight into freedom. Systems built over generations do not vanish in a single season. But the foundation had shifted. The plantation that once operated with untouchable confidence now functioned under watchful eyes from outside authorities. Abuse could no longer occur without fear of documentation. Eliza continued cooking. Outwardly, her role remained unchanged. She stirred pots, baked bread, prepared meals for a household shrinking in influence. But inwardly, she carried something different. Not just memory, not just written truth, but proof that even within structures designed to silence, documentation could fracture power. Years later, long after Caldwell's holdings diminished and Ravenhill changed ownership under financial strain, stories circulated quietly about a cook who had written everything down. No one spoke her name openly at first. Protection remained instinctive. But among those who survived those years, there was understanding. The fire that had refused to obey had not been the most important blaze. The real destruction had traveled folded in paper, carried in a flour sack, delivered in silence. History often remembers the powerful by name and forgets those who stood in kitchens and listened. But sometimes the quietest witness becomes the sharpest weapon. Sometimes ink outlives chains. Sometimes the person considered least significant becomes the author of collapse. And somewhere beyond Ravenhill, preserved in careful archives, rested pages written by steady hands in candlelight, proof that the darkest systems depend not only on cruelty, but on secrecy. Secrecy, once broken, does not easily rebuild. The plantation cook who heard every secret did not burn the estate to the ground. She did something far more dangerous. She made sure the truth survived.